Alright, welcome to part 5 in the Atlantis video series. This is going to be the Egypt-Atlantis connection. So, the priests of Sais tell Solon that their goddesses, Athena for Athens and Neith for Sais, are one and the same. They say the goddess who is the common patron, parent, and educator of both our cities founded your city 1,000 years before ours, receiving from the earth and Hephaestus the seed of your race, and then afterward ours was founded, which is 8,000 years old. So, if Solon visited Sais around 590 BC, somewhere around then that would give a date of the founding of Proto-Athens, we can say, around 9600 BC, and Proto-Sais around 8600 BC, roundabouts. And of course, he's saying the events of 9,000 years, 9600 BC, would be the Atlantean War, which we've already discussed a bit. Interestingly, Neith, the Egyptian equivalent of Athena, is associated with this other deity, Mehet Weret, who's a kind of solar cow deity, whose titles include mound and island, and whose name means great flood. So that's an interesting connection to Atlantis, which was an island and a mound, which was flooded, of course. And the next episode, we'll talk about the cattle symbolism and imagery associated with Atlantis. This is Proclus writing a commentary on Plato's Timaeus, and he's writing around 5th century AD. With respect to the whole narration about the Atlantics, some say that it is a mere history, which was the opinion of Crantor, the first interpreter of Plato, who says that Plato was derided by those of his time as not being the inventor of the Republic, but merely transcribing what the Egyptians had written on this subject. But again, Crantor believes it is mere history, and he adds that this is testified by the prophets of the Egyptians, who assert that these particulars are written on pillars which are still preserved. Others again say that this narration is a fable and a fictitious account of things. So Proclus is saying that there are mixed opinions on this. And others refer to the analysis of the fixed stars and planets, so that they assume the Athenians analogous to the fixed stars and the Atlantics to the planets. So that's kind of like a hermetic, astrological, as above, so below, non-literal interpretation. So this claim about Crantor saying that the Atlantis story is real and it was preserved on Egyptian pillars in his day. So Crantor is around 3rd century BC. We have a temple a little while after Crantor is writing. In the Ptolemaic period, the Edfu temple starts being built around 237 BC. And according to Dr. Manu Safzadeh, who's the main translator of this text into English, he's working with Dieter Kuth, who originally translated the Edfu building texts into German. He is saying that there is an analog, an analogous story that was preserved in Egypt, in fact. And although this Edfu temple dates to a little bit later than Crantor, Manu Safzadeh is arguing that based on forensic linguistics, it was composed in authentic Middle Egyptian, which was only in use until 1500 BC. So he's saying that this story is at least as old as 1500 BC, if not older, and that the Ptolemaic scribes are merely transcribing or copying an older text that was composed in this authentic Middle Egyptian. So in terms of forensic linguistics, that would be like if you or I tried to mimic Old English by saying ye and thou shalt and trying to make it sound Shakespearean and shit. That would, like a real linguist would be able to pick up on that and be like, oh, that's not authentic. That's just someone later trying to mimic that language to make it sound old. But he's arguing that it had to have been composed before authentic Middle Egyptian fell out of use in 1500 BC. So, not only that, but within the Edfu texts, it says that Horus's rule began 7,000 years before the text was composed. So 7,000 plus 1,500 is 8,500 BC, right? So the date extracted, according to Dr. Manu Safzadeh, is sometime before 8,500 BC for the start of Horus's reign. And also in this article, he's arguing against the interpretation of Plato's account of Atlantis as being a noble lie, and in favor of the interpretation that Plato is telling the truth when he relates that the story comes from the Egyptians, particularly because of the similarities to this arguably much older Egyptian story, which was being copied and transcribed and passed down, maybe in different temples which no longer exist, maybe one of which was what Crantor was referring to, because obviously this temple was made after Crantor's time. But this also lines up pretty closely with the date in the Platonic dialogues of 8,590 BC or so for the founding of what we said is Proto-Sais, or the Proto-Sais people. So Horus's reign, according to the Edfu text and Dr. Manu Safzadeh's translation of it, is sometime before 8,500 BC, and then, according to Plato, Proto-Sais is around 8,600 BC. So, lines up pretty closely. And there's some more parallels between the Edfu text and the Atlantis narrative. One is the crew of Horus is embarking for a place of building, and some deity calls out, "See the potter's wheel," as to carrying out the building, which in some translations of the Critias, it says Poseidon turned as if with a lathe and chisel the rings of Atlantis, so that they were at every point equidistant from each other, which I thought was an interesting parallel in imagery with the potter's wheel, turning a lathe and chisel. And in the Edfu text, you see a lot of references to island, the floodland, great primeval mound, round arrival site, great primeval mound. Where are the island ones? Ray Island, floodborne, pristine sites. Okay. He's saying, they're saying in the Edfu texts, the flood is ebbing, the primeval island is emerging, the crew of Horus is arriving there, paying homage to the father. Reaching the place of the flood, the Shebtu call out the demarcation of the shoreline of the site where the crew is. Okay. The Shebtu thrust back the flood, and the 4 crews of Horus arrive. So again, this is happening after the flood. The start of Horus's reign is sometime before 8,500 BC, which again is after the flood of 9,600, when Atlantis sank. So it sounds like this is after the flood has receded a bit. The crews of Horus are going to retake whatever remains of Atlantis, and Horus is starting his reign at this time, around 8,600 BC, it seems like. If indeed the arrival of these crews, does line up with the start of Horus's reign. which the Edfu text is saying is 7,000 years before it's composed. Another thing Manu Safezadeh argues for is that Solon transliterated, not translated, this Egyptian phrase, flood-born pristine sites, via these steps into Atlantis. Now, he's arguing for transliteration, but interestingly, within the Critias, it says that the names are actually translations. So it's claiming that the Egyptians translated Atlantean names into Egyptian, and then Solon translated those Egyptian names in turn into Greek, right? So if the translation was perfect, they should have the same meanings as the original names, but they're translations, not transliterations. So the meaning will be preserved, but not the sound. But this is saying that the sound is changing based on the Greek tongue, is what Dr. Safezadeh is arguing. So he's arguing for transliteration, whereas the Critias itself is saying that the names are translated. So, yeah, perhaps, I mean, it could be a question of how good was Solon's Egyptian, you know, whether he was able to translate all those names or not, I guess. Now, Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus give some interesting dates for Egypt. You can take a look here. I'm not going to read it all, but I'll sum it up in a second. So Herodotus is saying that Heracles is like 17,000 years old. He's saying that there's two, actually. There's one later in like the Bronze or Iron Age, but there's a 17,000-year-old Heracles. And he's also saying that the first king of Egypt is like from 10,000 years ago. So it's very interesting, but we'll calculate those dates. He's also saying that the Egyptians claim that no god in human form had ever arose in Egypt during that time or since. But he's also saying that Heracles existed and he's a god. So it's an interesting little contradiction. Diodorus Siculus relates about the genesis of the gods, that the view of the Atlanteans doesn't differ greatly from the myths of the Greeks, which is that the gods were born among them, you know, on the shores of the ocean, the edge of the ocean there. And Diodorus Siculus is saying that gods and heroes ruled Egypt at first, and then the last of these was Horus, and then after that, mortals ruled over their country. So to sum up these dates, we get about 9600 BC for the invasion of Atlantis, according to Plato. Also for the founding of Proto-Athens. We get about 8600 BC for the founding of Proto-Sais. That also lines up with Safezadeh's date from forensic analysis of the Edfu texts, plus, you know, using the actual textual evidence itself, the 7,000 years within the text, to come up with a date of before 8500, which lines up with that 8600. Herodotus is saying that Heracles lived about like 17,000 BC or whatever. He's saying Dionysus is 15,000 BC, and that the Egyptians' first king was like 11,800 BC, right? If you do the math, he has like an elaborate calculation for the number of generations and how long a generation is. So Diodorus Siculus, he's saying that the time of Isis and Osiris was either about 23,000 BC or around a little earlier than 10,000 BC, maybe around 10,500 BC, which, as we'll see in a future video, is very relevant to some things that Edgar Cayce said. But elsewhere, he also says that mortals ruled Egypt for a little less than 5,000 years up to his time, and gods and heroes ruled for 18,000 years before that. So 5,000 plus 18,000 is 23,000 BC, of which the last was Horus. So Diodorus Siculus is saying gods and heroes ruled Egypt from 23,000 BC up until 5,000 BC, and the last one was Horus. And, maybe if Horus was like a dynasty or something like that, then maybe that was like a dynasty that lasted from 8600 BC over to this 5,000. Who knows? But it also seems like around 8500 BC, the events of the Edfu text are saying that Horus is retaking the primeval mound after the flood has ebbed, which is interesting. Now we'll just touch on a little bit of the archaeology. So we don't have much at Sais as far as looking for a proto-Sais. The settlement there only goes back to the Neolithic in 4200 BC. But in Upper Egypt in the south, we do have a little bit more going back a little bit later. We have Nabta Playa, which is like a stone circle calendar, astronomically aligned site, occupied as early as 8400 BC. And cattle pastoralism vocabulary entering Nilo-Saharan language family around 8500 BC, interestingly. And we have some domestic cattle pretty early at Nabta Playa as well. So let's see here. And we've also got the Ibero-Maurusians, which, as we discussed in the first video, are associated by Mary Sedagast. And also, if you just look at the setting, the time and place of the Atlantean invaders into Africa, it matches with the range of the Ibero-Maurusians, like we covered in the first video. And that culture starts as early as 23,000 BC, right? So that's another interesting thing. And Diodorus is saying, again, that the gods were born near the edge of the ocean, with the Atlanteans among them, and that this is the same as the Greeks' account, which is very interesting, right? So overall, we have, we mentioned on the last video with the timeline that Atlantis was possibly founded around 23,000 BC based on the start of the Ibero-Maurusian and their connection with Atlantis, and as well as the Solutrean hypothesis potentially starting as early as 20,000 BC or so, having that transatlantic connection. And again, also Mary Sedagast associates the Egyptians who fought against the Atlantean invasion in 9600 BC with the Kadan. And they would be a culture along the Nile, mostly the upper Nile, not so much the Delta, I don't think. But she cites the Jebel Sahaba cemetery, which could date to about 9500 BC, which seems to be warfare again, as you see here. We covered that in the first video. But yeah, so that's some of the very old dates that Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus give for events concerning Egypt, but also events given by Plato's account, coming through the priests of Sais, supposedly, and also a date coming from the Edfu texts and a little bit of forensic linguistics. So we'll be putting these together more with more archaeology and stuff like that a little bit later. But yeah, that should do it for now. That is the Egypt connection.